On my granddaughter's 6th birthday, my phone rang while my hands were still covered in frosting, halfway through the cake I was making for her. My son said, his voice cold, "Don't come. We canceled everything on your side. You're not invited. Don't make things awkward. 3 months of planning, nearly $3,000. One sentence. Erased it all. I still went. And the moment I saw that party, I froze. And in that exact moment, I knew this was only the beginning. Before we go further, I'm grateful you're here. Drop a comment and tell me what country or city are you watching from. I read every single one. A quick note: this story contains fictional elements woven in for reflection and storytelling purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental, but everything it's trying to tell you is worth hearing. I was up before the sun that Saturday morning, the way I've been most mornings since Margot passed. Old habits from 30 years of opening the shop at 6. Your body forgets a lot of things as you get older, but it never forgets a schedule. I stood at the kitchen counter in the dark, reaching for the light above the stove, the same way I always do. The same way I did when Margot was alive, and would already be sitting at the table with her coffee, watching me fumble around like I owned the place, but couldn't find anything in it. I turned on just that one light. It was enough. The apron was hanging on the hook by the pantry door, blue cotton faded almost gray now, with a small embroidered rooster near the bottom left corner that had lost most of its red thread over the years. Margot bought it at a craft fair in Purcellville sometime in the late 90s. She wore it every time she baked. When she got sick and couldn't stand long enough to cook anymore, she hung it on that hook, and somewhere along the way, without either of us making a decision about it, it became mine. I put it on the same way every morning I cook something that matters. Loop the neck strap, tie the waist strings twice. It's not superstition. It's just the closest thing I have to telling her I'm still here, still trying. Her recipe book was already open on the counter. I'd left it there the night before, turned to page 43. Rose petal cake. Her handwriting filled the margins the way it always did. Little notes to herself about what worked and what didn't, adjustments she had made over the years. Use real vanilla, never extract. Let the second layer cool completely, or the ganache slides. She'd made this cake every year for Colton's birthday when he was growing up, right up until he turned 16 and decided he was too old for his mother's cooking. She'd laughed about that. She always laughed about things that would have made me stubborn. I was making it today for Hazel. Hazel June Mercer, 6 years old, as of that morning, April 6th, my only grandchild. And the reason I had been awake since before dawn, with something in my chest that I can only describe as the particular happiness of a man who has been given a second chance at something he didn't do quite right the first time. She has her grandmother's eyes, deep brown, almost amber near the center, when the light catches them, just so. The first time I held her in the delivery room, 6 years ago, in a hospital in Ashburn, Virginia, barely an hour after she came into the world, I looked down at that tiny face and felt something rearrange itself inside me. I whispered to her that her grandmother would have loved her until it hurt. I meant every word. For the past 3 months I had been planning the party. Not 3 weeks, 3 months. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to what comes later. Back in January, I'd sat down with Colton at this very kitchen table and asked if I could be the one to throw Hazel's 6th birthday. He said absolutely without hesitating. We talked about themes, and I called Hazel on video chat that same evening to ask what she wanted. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds and said she wanted to be a real princess at a real party. So that's what I set out to build. I booked the garden pavilion at Morven Park in Leesburg, about 12 miles from my house. If you've never been, Morven Park is a historic estate with grounds that open up for private events. Stone pathways, old trees, open fields, and in spring flower beds that Margot would have stood in front of for an hour. I put down a deposit in February. I hired a face painter who specialized in children's events, and a woman who twisted flowers into crowns and centerpieces out of real blooms. I arranged for a small horse-drawn carriage to circle the grounds, twice enough for every child to have a turn. I ordered custom fairy tale invitations and sent them to 22 families. I had a local bakery carve Hazel's name into a wooden sign to hang at the pavilion entrance. The total came to just under $2,800. Every cent of it planned, budgeted, and paid. And then there was the crown. I made it myself over 3 evenings in the garage at the workbench where I used to rebuild carburetors for a living. Fake flowers, wire framing ribbon, and a hot glue gun I'd borrowed from Rosemary next door and never returned. My hands aren't what they used to be. The knuckles stiffen up in cold weather, and the right index finger doesn't bend all the way since an accident with a press lift back in 2009. But I took my time. I worked slowly. I thought about Hazel the whole time, about the look she'd have on her face when she saw it, and my hands didn't shake once. I set it on the kitchen table the night before, so I wouldn't forget it in the morning. Now, I was standing at the counter in Margot's apron, working on the final layer of the rose petal cake, placing each cream flower by hand, the way her notes instructed. The kitchen smelled the way it used to smell on Colton's birthdays when he was small. Butter and vanilla, and something warm underneath it all. Something that didn't have a name, but that felt like the house remembering itself. I was pressing the last petal into place when my phone buzzed on the counter beside the recipe book. I looked at the screen. Colton. I wiped my hands on the apron, leaving 2 faint flour marks just below the faded rooster. Then I picked up the phone. He was calling early, which I figured meant he was excited about the party. Maybe asking what time to show up. Maybe calling to say Hazel had woken up already and wouldn't stop talking about her crown. I pressed answer. What I heard on the other end of that call was not what I expected, and it changed everything about the morning I had planned. I want to tell you exactly what happened on that call. All of it, including the part that came before I even said hello. He called first. That was the thing I hadn't expected, that he would be the one to call, that he wouldn't wait for me to reach out and make it easier for everyone, the way I always had. I picked up on the second ring. Dad! His voice was flat, not angry. Flat in the way that means someone has rehearsed what they're about to say and has decided to deliver it without inflection. So it sounds like information rather than cruelty. Don't come today. We've canceled everything on your end. You're not invited. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I stood at the kitchen counter with the phone against my ear and the rose petal cake half finished on the stand in front of me. I did not say anything for a moment. I built her a crown, I said.
Dad!
3 nights in the garage. I booked Morven Park in February. I sent invitations to 22 families. I know. A pause, then quieter. I'm sorry, but this is how it has to be. I heard Celeste in the background, her voice low and directional, the sound of someone managing a situation from the sidelines. Colton said something to her I couldn't make out. Then he came back on the line. Don't come, Dad, please. I ended the call. I stood at that counter for a while. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough for the cake stand to stop being something I had made with my hands and start being something I didn't know what to do with. Long enough for the crown on the kitchen table to go from a thing I was proud of to a thing that had nowhere to go. I untied the apron strings. I left the apron on. I picked up the cake, the whole 3-layer rose petal cake from page 43 of Margot's recipe book, the one I'd started at 5 in the morning, the one that smelled like every birthday Colton ever had growing up. And I carried it out the front door. Rosemary lives next door in the tan colonial with the wind chimes on the porch. She's been my neighbor for 11 years, a retired school teacher who keeps a vegetable garden and leaves her porch light on all night. I walked up her front steps, set the cake down on her welcome mat, and rang the bell. When I heard movement inside, I turned around and went back home. I didn't wait to see her face. I didn't leave a note. I didn't want to explain anything to anyone. I just needed the cake to be somewhere, it would be appreciated, and I needed my hands to be empty. Back inside, I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room, the recipe book still open on the counter, the crown still on the table, the flour marks from my hands still on the front of Margot's apron. I thought about what Colton had said to me, not to Celeste, not to someone else, to me directly on purpose. Don't come. You're not invited. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. He had known exactly what he was doing. That was the part that stayed with me. He wasn't wrong. In 41 years of being his father, I had never once raised my voice at him in anger. I had swallowed more than I should have, smiled through more than I should have, and written check after check after check, while telling myself it was love and not avoidance. He had learned somewhere along the way that I would absorb whatever he handed me and come back the next day asking what he needed. He had learned it from me. That was the part that stung the most. I walked to the hook by the front door and took down my keys. I told myself I just needed some air, a drive to clear my head, nothing more. But I already knew where I was going. McLean is about 35 miles from my house in Loudoun County, depending on which way you take Route 7. On a Saturday morning with light traffic, you can make it in under 40 minutes. I know this because I'd made the drive a handful of times over the years for Colton and Celeste's dinner parties, and one Thanksgiving that I'd rather not dwell on. Each time, I came home feeling like a man who had spent an evening in a country where he didn't speak the language. I told myself I wasn't going to stop. I told myself I was just driving, that I needed the movement of the road, something to occupy my hands while my head sorted through the morning. I believed that right up until I turned onto Brookside Drive and saw the line of vehicles parked along the curb. I've driven past a lot of houses in my life, but I had never sat outside one feeling like a stranger looking in at my own family. The Harrington property sits back from the road, behind a wrought iron fence, the kind with pointed finials at the top that cost more per foot than most people's monthly car payments. The fence runs the full length of the front property, black and clean, recently painted by the look of it. Through the bars, you could see the grounds clearly, a wide open lawn that rolled back toward the house, old oak trees that had been there longer than any of us, and on that particular Saturday afternoon, every inch of it in use. I parked across the street. I sat in the truck for a moment with both hands on the wheel, looking at the line of vehicles along the curb at the wrought iron fence. At the lawn beyond it, full of children and spring light and the particular ease of people who have never once been made to feel like they don't belong. Then I got out. I don't know exactly what I intended when I crossed the street. I'm not sure I intended anything. I walked to the gate the way you walk towards something, when your feet have made a decision your mind hasn't caught up to yet. The gate was open, wide open, the way gates are at parties where everyone is expected and no one needs to be turned away. I stepped inside. I found Hazel in 30 seconds. She was spinning in her tulle skirt, throwing her arms out, laughing at whatever was happening inside that skirt. She had no idea I was there. I stood at the edge of the lawn and watched her. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough to see Colton under the pergola, with Reginald Amber drinks relaxed laughter, the posture of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. Long enough to see the professional fairy garden, the pony ride, the bar cart, the 50 people who had all received the right invitation. Long enough to understand, with a clarity I had been avoiding for years, that this was not a bad day, or a misunderstanding, or a thing that could be explained away. This was the arrangement. It had always been the arrangement. I was the only one who hadn't known. No one approached me. No one asked me to leave. That was almost worse, the way the party simply continued around me, the way my presence registered as nothing more than background. One more adult standing on a lawn on a Saturday afternoon in McLean. I looked at Hazel one more time. Then I turned and walked back through the gate, back across the street, back to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I started the engine. The drive back to Loudoun County took longer than the drive out. Traffic had picked up on Route 7, the usual Saturday afternoon crawl through the suburbs. I didn't mind. I needed the time. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Sycamore Ridge Road, the afternoon light was going golden, the way it does in Virginia in April. That particular slant that makes everything look warmer than it is. I had a laptop at home and a bottle of bourbon in the cabinet above the refrigerator. That evening I used both. My home office is a small room off the hallway, barely enough space for a desk, a filing cabinet, and the bookshelves Margot filled with paperbacks she never had time to finish. I've kept most of them where she left them, not to preserve anything, because sometimes I'll pull one out and find a bookmark she tucked in halfway through, and that's worth something I don't have a word for. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon, sat down at the desk, and opened the laptop. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture that you notice differently after a day like the one I'd had. I wasn't looking at the April dark outside the window. I was looking at the screen. I started with what I knew. The wedding was first. 6 years ago, Colton and Celeste were married at a vineyard outside Napa Valley, Celeste's choice, Colton's enthusiastic agreement. My contribution was $28,000. My share of the rehearsal dinner flights and accommodations for 14 family members who couldn't have attended otherwise, and a cash gift that Cordelia described in her thank you note as generous. I flew home in a middle seat on a red-eye and told myself it was worth every penny because Colton looked happy. I typed wedding contribution, $28,000, then the house. 3 years ago, Colton and Celeste bought a 4-bedroom colonial in Ashburn, nice neighborhood, good school district, more expensive than it should have been. They needed help with the down payment. I loaned them $95,000. We had a promissory note drawn up, signed by both of them, $1,500 a month, beginning 60 days after closing. The original is in the filing cabinet 2 feet to my right. In 3 years, I received 4 payments totaling $4,500. I typed house loan, $95,000, repaid $4,500, outstanding $90,500. Then Hazel's college fund. I had opened a 529 account the month after she was born, $650 a month every month 5 years, 0 missed, 60 months, $650 each, $39,000. I typed it, then the credit card. 5 years ago, I added Colton as an authorized user for emergencies, I told myself. According to the statements I pulled up, he had used it for restaurant meals, 2 golf outings at a Leesburg course that charges $300 around a weekend hotel, stay with no explanation, and a scattering of smaller charges I didn't recognize. Total, $4,200. I typed it. Then the party. Morven Park, deposit the vendors, the carriage, the custom invitations, the small dresses, the catering order from a family restaurant in Leesburg, $2,800. I had confirmed that morning that none of it was refundable. The venue contract had been clear on that point, and Colton had canceled with less than 12 hours' notice. Every vendor had the same answer. The money was gone. I added it to the column and kept going. I typed it. Then I kept going, because those were the large amounts, the ones with paper trails. But there were 10 years of smaller things too. The transmission that went out the first winter after the wedding, the anniversary trip to Charleston, the dinner tabs, the hardware store runs the spontaneous things that seem reasonable in the moment and unremarkable in isolation. When I stopped typing and looked at the total at the bottom of the column, the number on the screen in the blue-white light of that dark room was $285,000. I sat with it for a long time. Margot's photograph was on the corner of the desk, taken the summer before she got sick. She's standing in the backyard squinting into the sun, laughing at something off camera that I can no longer remember. She looks the way she always looked, when she was happy, unself-conscious, a little windswept, more interested in whatever was funny than in how she appeared. I thought about what she would say. She would have been angry long before I was. That was the simple truth. Margot had instincts about people that I never developed. She'd read a room in 30 seconds and understand things that would take me 30 minutes of conversation to figure out. She saw Celeste clearly from that first dinner in McLean. She never said anything unkind. She wasn't that kind of woman. But I could tell by the way she'd go quiet in the car on the way home, looking out the window, not saying much. I should have listened to her quiet. The last real conversation we had, hospital room 3 days before she died, she held my hand and said 3 things. She said she wasn't afraid. She said the garden would need attention in the fall. And she said, take care of our boy. I had spent 10 years executing that instruction, with the diligence of a man who believed love was something you could demonstrate through consistency and sacrifice. $285,000 worth of consistency. 10 years of sacrifice absorbed so completely that Colton had stopped noticing it was sacrifice at all. Sitting in that dark office, I understood for the first time that I had gotten it wrong. Taking care of Colton did not mean absorbing every consequence of his choices until he stopped experiencing any. It did not mean funding a life he had never once looked at me and said thank you for. Margot hadn't meant any of that. She had meant something simpler and harder and more honest. And it had taken me 10 years and a birthday party I wasn't invited to finally hear it. I closed the laptop. The room went dark except for the streetlight through the curtain. I sat there long enough for the bourbon to go warm in the glass, long enough for the anger I expected to feel to move through me and become something else quieter, more determined, and strangely not unpleasant. Then I stood up, rinsed the glass in the kitchen sink, and went to bed. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. I woke up at 6 that Monday morning with a calm that surprised even me. Not the calm of a man who had made peace with something. The calm of a man who had finally decided to stop making peace with the wrong things. I showered, made coffee, and ate a piece of toast, standing at the kitchen counter the way I always do, when I'm not cooking a real meal. I did not look at Margot's recipe book. I did not look at the crown, still sitting on the kitchen table, which I had not moved and would not move for another 3 days. I looked at my notepad. At the list I had written before going to bed, the night before, 4 items with boxes next to them, waiting to be checked. I was out the door by 8:15. Theodore Winslow has been my financial advisor for going on 14 years. His office is on Market Street in downtown Leesburg, above a sandwich shop that's been there since the 90s. I've sat across that desk through market corrections, the decision to sell the shop, the restructuring of my accounts after Margot passed. He's a careful man, methodical, the kind who reads the whole document before signing anything. I trust him the way you trust someone who has never once told you what you want to hear, just to make the conversation easier. I was in his office at 9 o'clock sharp. "I want to freeze Hazel's college fund," I said before he'd finished settling into his chair. "No more monthly deposits, effective immediately." He looked at me over the top of his glasses the way he does when he's deciding whether to push back. "That's a significant change, Roland. The 529 has been running for 5 years. Can I ask what's going on?" "Family restructuring," I said. Something in my tone told him not to pursue it. He nodded, once pulled up the account on his screen, and began the process. The $550 monthly transfer, automatic, set up years ago, never missed, was suspended before I left the building. First box checked. The bank was next. I drove the 4 blocks rather than walking because I had more stops after and didn't want to waste the time. I was at the service desk by 10:30, speaking with a branch manager I'd worked with before, on the shop accounts back when the business was still running. Removing Colton as an authorized user on my credit card was straightforward enough. A form, a signature, a conversation that lasted under 10 minutes. But I also asked them to cancel that card number entirely and issue me a new one. An authorized user being removed from an account doesn't automatically invalidate the card number they've been using. I'd read enough to know that. I wanted a clean break, not a technicality. The manager processed both requests without comment. I thanked her and left. Second box checked. My life insurance policy is through a provider I've been with since I was 34 years old. The policy has a face value of $680,000. For the past 10 years, since Margot died and the original beneficiary arrangement no longer applied, Colton had been listed as the sole beneficiary. I called the insurance company from the parking lot outside the bank. The process of changing a beneficiary on a life insurance policy is not complicated. You fill out a form, you submit it, the change takes effect. What's complicated is deciding what to put instead. I had thought about it the night before, sitting in the dark after I closed the laptop, and by the time I went to bed, I had settled on an answer. I listed the beneficiary as the Margot Mercer Foundation. The foundation didn't exist yet in any official capacity. No incorporation papers, no tax-exempt status, nothing registered with the state of Virginia. But the name existed in my mind with the kind of clarity that told me it was already real in every way that mattered. The legal structure would follow. It always does if the intention is solid enough. I would figure out what the foundation would actually do later. I had some ideas. For now, the name on the policy was changed, and that was enough. Third box checked. I was sitting across from Claudette Renard at noon. Claudette is a civil litigation attorney with an office in a converted Victorian on Cornwall Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse. She's been practicing law in Loudoun County for over 20 years, handles primarily contract disputes and property matters, and has the particular gift of explaining exactly what your options are without once making you feel like she's steering you toward any of them. I had used her once before, years ago, for a contract dispute with a supplier when the shop was still running. She remembered the case. She is the kind of lawyer who remembers cases. I laid out the situation clearly, the promissory note, the signed legal agreement obligating Colton and Celeste to repay the $95,000 home loan at $1,500 a month. The 3 years that had passed since the first payment was due, the 4 payments received totaling $4,500, the $90,500 still outstanding. Claudette listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her pen. "You have a few options," she said. "The first step and the right one is a formal demand letter. We send it certified mail, which creates a legal record that they received it, and give them 30 days to respond with either full payment or a proposed repayment schedule. And if they don't, then we file suit in Loudoun County Circuit Court. Your loan amount exceeds the $25,000 limit for small claims, so it goes to Circuit Court, which is the higher trial court here in Virginia. It takes longer, but the judgment carries more weight." She paused. "Once we file Roland, the case becomes public record. Anyone can look it up. It will have both their names on it." I looked at her evenly. "Send the letter and prepare the filing." She nodded. "I'll have the letter drafted by end of day." She did. I approved it by 3:30, and it went out by certified mail before the post office on Market Street closed at 4. 4th box checked. I drove home on Route 15, the long way past the fields that are still farmland in the western part of the county, before everything turns to subdivision. The afternoon was cooling off. That particular late April chill that comes back after a warm week and reminds you that spring in Virginia hasn't quite committed yet. I had the window down anyway. When I pulled into the driveway on Sycamore Ridge Road, I didn't go inside right away. I sat on the front porch for a while, in the wooden chair I'd built myself 20 years ago and repaired twice since. The oak tree in the side yard was budding out that pale yellow green that only lasts a week before it goes full leaf. The tire swing hung from the lowest branch, turning slowly in the April wind. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about the last time Hazel had been on it back in February, when I'd had her for a Wednesday afternoon, and she'd insisted on the swing, even though it was 40 degrees, and I'd made her wear her coat. She'd pumped her legs until she was going as high as the rope would allow, yelling at me to watch, Grandpa, are you watching? I had been watching. I was always watching. The tire swing moved a little in the April wind. I wondered how long it would be before Hazel sat in it again. I didn't have an answer for that, but for the first time in a long time, I had answers for everything else. To understand why that Monday morning mattered, you need to understand what I spent 38 years building before it, not just the shop, everything. I grew up in Fauquier County, the next county over, from Loudoun, in a house with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom that my father had built himself on a piece of land his father had left him. We didn't have much, but we had the land, and my father had the kind of hands that could fix anything that broke, which meant we rarely needed what we didn't have. I learned engines from him the way some kids learn piano, by sitting next to someone better and paying attention until you could do it yourself. I moved to Loudoun County when I was 26, chasing a job at a dealership service department on Route 7 that paid decent money and had room to grow. I stayed 2 years, learned what I could, saved what I earned. Then, at 28, I signed a lease on a 2-bay garage off Route 15, painted the name Mercer Auto Works on the door myself, with a brush I bought at the hardware store in Purcellville, and opened for business. The early years were lean in the way that early years always are. I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. I did oil changes and brake jobs and transmission rebuilds and whatever else came through the door. I never went to college, but I could rebuild a transmission blindfolded by the time I was 25, and in the automotive business that matters more than a diploma. Customers found me because I was honest with them, which is rarer in that industry than it should be. They came back because I was good. Over the next decade, I expanded the shop twice and built a crew of 8 mechanics that I trusted with anything. By the time I was 40, Mercer Auto Works was doing well enough that I had stopped worrying about money in any active way. The shop ran. The bills were paid. There was enough left over to invest, to save, to build something that would hold. What I hadn't built yet was a life outside of it. Margot changed that. Oh, I met her at a community art show in downtown Leesburg on a Saturday afternoon in October when I had gone specifically because a customer whose car I'd just saved from a blown head gasket had told me his wife was showing her watercolors there, and I felt I owed him the attendance. I almost didn't go. I'm glad I did. Margot was standing in front of her own work when I found her section. 3 medium-sized paintings of the Blue Ridge in autumn, the kind of paintings that made you feel the cold in them. She was explaining something to a woman beside her about color temperature, gesturing at the upper corner of the largest canvas with the particular intensity of someone who cared very much whether the other person understood. She was wearing paint-stained jeans and a green sweater, and she had not done anything special with her hair. She was the most interesting person in the room. I introduced myself badly, said something forgettable about the paintings, and she rescued the conversation by asking what I did for a living. When I told her, she looked at my hands the way mechanics get used to people looking at their hands, with a mild involuntary assessment. And then she said something I have never forgotten. "You've got grease under your fingernails and kindness in your eyes. That's a strange combination." I told her she was the most wrong-right person I'd ever met. We were married 14 months later. Margot taught art classes at Northern Virginia Community College for 22 years. She kept a studio in the spare bedroom upstairs, and the house always smelled faintly of linseed oil and whatever she was working on. She made friends easily remembered, everything laughed often, and had the particular gift of knowing when someone needed to be told the truth and when they needed to be left alone to figure it out themselves. She was better at people than I was. She always had been. Colton was born the year before I opened the shop, which meant he grew up inside it as much as inside our house on Sycamore Ridge Road. By the time he was 8, he knew every tool by name, could identify an engine problem by sound with reasonable accuracy, and had developed strong opinions about which fast food restaurant we stopped at on the way home from fishing trips to the Potomac. Those were good years, some of the best. I remember one Saturday in particular. Colton must have been 8, maybe 9. We were doing an oil change on a customer's truck, and I was walking him through each step the way my father had walked me through things. He was so careful. He laid the tools out in the order he'd need them, just like I'd shown him. When we finished and he tightened the drain plug and looked up at me, waiting to see if he'd done it right, the look on his face when I nodded was something I kept for a long time. That boy was in there somewhere. I want you to know that. Whatever happened later, whoever he became, that careful 8-year-old with grease on his forearms and his grandfather's focus in his eyes was real. I did not imagine him. Margot was diagnosed in the spring of what turned out to be our last good year together. Pancreatic cancer, which moves fast and doesn't negotiate. We had 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She spent most of them the way she'd spent most of her life. Painting, teaching when she was able, laughing at things I found unremarkable, and being more honest with me than I always deserved. After she died, I kept the shop running for 2 years on momentum and stubbornness. Then I sold it, not because I had to, but because walking into that building every morning, without anyone to come home and tell about it, had stopped making sense. I sold it, invested the proceeds, and retired to the house on Sycamore Ridge Road, which was paid off and full of her books and her paintings and that apron with the rooster on it. Colton was a good kid. I need you to know that before I tell you the rest, because what happened to him didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, the way Russ does. Colton met Celeste Harrington the fall of his junior year at the University of Virginia down in Charlottesville. I remember the first time he brought her to Loudoun County. The way she looked at my garage told me everything I needed to know. I just chose not to listen. The Harringtons were McLean money, old money, the kind of family that had a tennis court in the backyard and an opinion about everything, including men like me. I want to be careful here, because I'm aware that what I'm about to say could sound like bitterness, and I don't want to give it more weight than it deserves. The truth is simpler than bitterness. The Harringtons existed in a world that operated by different rules than the one I grew up in. And from the moment Colton brought Celeste home to Loudoun County, I understood that those two worlds were going to have a hard time sharing a table. I just didn't understand yet how literally I meant that. Celeste came to our house on Sycamore Ridge Road for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in October, not long after Colton had told us he was serious about her. She was polished in the way that people are polished, when they've been polished their whole lives, not performing elegance, just wearing it. The way you wear something you put on so long ago, you've forgotten it's there. She was pleasant. She asked about the house, complimented the kitchen, said the right things. But when Colton took her out back to show her the yard, I watched her glance at the detached garage where I kept my tools and the old workbench I hadn't had the heart to clear out since selling the shop. It was a brief look, the kind that lasts less than a second and means nothing in isolation. But I had spent 38 years reading the way people look at machinery, and I knew the difference between curiosity and assessment. She assessed it, found it wanting, moved on. I didn't say anything to Margot about it that evening, but she brought it up herself on the drive to church the following Sunday, unprompted. The way she sometimes surfaced things, she'd been turning over quietly for a week. "That girl is very careful," Margot said. Careful how? Careful about what she lets herself react to. That's not always a good sign. I thought about that for a moment and then let it go, because Colton seemed happy, and at the time, I believed that was the thing that mattered most. We had dinner at the Harrington home in McLean the following spring. It was the first time I met Reginald and Cordelia, and I want to describe it accurately because I think it explains a great deal about everything that came after. The house was on a cul-de-sac off Chainbridge Road, set back from the street behind a boxwood hedge that must have been 20 years old. Inside, it was the kind of house that looks effortless and costs an extraordinary amount to maintain that appearance. Original art on the walls, furniture that had clearly been selected by someone who knew what they were doing, a kitchen that had been renovated recently enough that it still smelled faintly of new cabinetry. Reginald Harrington was a tall man, with silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades being listened to in rooms. He shook my hand with the right amount of firmness, asked my name, asked what I did for a living. When I told him I had run an automotive shop in Loudoun County for 30 years before retiring, he nodded the way people nod when they have already stopped listening politely, with his chin like a door closing quietly so as not to disturb anyone. He didn't ask a follow-up question. Cordelia was more indirect about it. She didn't look at my hands the way some people do, the involuntary flinch at the calluses, the permanent stain around the nail beds that never quite comes out, no matter how long you've been retired. She simply didn't look at my hands at all, which was its own kind of statement. She spoke to me in the careful, generous tones of a woman who has learned to be gracious to people she has already categorized. Dinner was fine. The food was excellent. The conversation stayed at the surface, which suited everyone, and by the end of the evening, I had said enough to be polite and not enough to be remembered. Driving home on the toll road, Margot sat quietly beside me for a long time. "Well," she said finally. "Yeah," I said. That was the whole conversation. We didn't need more. What I kept thinking about on that drive home was not Reginald's handshake or Cordelia's careful graciousness or the art on the walls that probably cost more than my first year of shop revenue. What I kept thinking about was a moment near the end of dinner when Colton had said something small. A comment about a restaurant in Charlottesville he and Celeste had been to, and Reginald had laughed and leaned forward and said, "Tell me more," and Colton had leaned forward too. The way he used to lean toward me in the garage when he was 12 and wanted me to think he already understood something he was still figuring out. That forward tilt. That eagerness to be seen as belonging. I had recognized it immediately. I just hadn't been ready to understand what it meant. Colton and Celeste were married 3 years later at a vineyard in the Napa Valley. The venue was Celeste's choice, and it was beautiful stone buildings, rows of vines, and late afternoon light. The kind of setting that photographs well and feels slightly unreal when you're standing inside it. I contributed $28,000 to the wedding costs. That covered the rehearsal dinner, which I hosted, and the flights and accommodations for 14 members of our family who traveled from Virginia and wouldn't have been able to come otherwise. The reception seating chart was managed entirely by Cordelia. I found my table after the ceremony, following the small numbered cards the way everyone does at a wedding, where you don't know most of the guests. My table was near the side entrance to the catering prep area, close enough that I could hear the kitchen staff moving around behind the door when it swung open. I was seated with two of Colton's college friends I'd met once before, a distant cousin of mine who didn't know anyone, and a couple from Celeste's mother's tennis club who had apparently also failed to make the main seating arrangement. The Harrington family occupied the 5 tables nearest the dance floor. I looked at Colton from across the room. He was standing with Celeste at the head table laughing at something, looking the way a man looks on his wedding day when everything is going the way he hoped. He glanced in my direction once during the cocktail hour. I raised my glass. He smiled and looked away. That smile told me something I wasn't ready to hear. Not the smile itself. Colton had always had a good smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made people feel seen. It was the looking away that came after, quick, clean. The way you look away from something when holding your gaze would cost you more than you're willing to spend in front of the people who are watching. I told myself what mattered was that he was happy. I told myself that a lot in those years. It became a habit the way certain thoughts do when you repeat them often enough to stop examining them. I ate my dinner. I danced with my cousin Linda during one song near the end of the night. I flew home the next morning in a window seat and watched California disappear below the clouds and told myself again that the distance between a father and his son was something that could be crossed with enough time and enough patience. I was wrong about both. 2 years later, Hazel was born, and for a while, a good solid, while I let myself believe that the distance between us was something that could be healed with enough time and enough love. I was wrong about the second part too, but Hazel was real, and she was here, and for the next 5 years, she would be the reason I kept showing up at a table where I had long since stopped being invited to sit. That at least I was right about. In the 5 years since Hazel was born, I kept every promise to the child before it understood the meaning of a promise. I promised there would always be that someone at the gate. I promised the kitchen would always smell like something baking on Friday afternoons. I promised that Margot's recipe book, the one with her handwriting pressed deep into the margins, her pencil corrections, her small stars beside the recipes Colton loved as a boy, would stay open on the counter so Hazel could learn the way her grandmother once taught. I kept every one of those promises, not because anyone was watching, because I needed something to hold on to, and promises were the only currency I had left that felt real. She was born on a Tuesday in March 2018. Colton called me at 6:14 in the morning, and I had been awake since 4, not from worry, from something I didn't have a name for, yet a feeling that sat in the center of my chest, like a stone that was somehow warm. When he said she's here, she's perfect. I put the phone down on the kitchen table and didn't pick it up again for several minutes. I just sat there with Margot's apron draped over the back of the chair, the one she wore every Sunday, and I thought this is the part she would have loved most. For 2 full years, Wednesday and Friday were mine. Ashburn Preschool released at noon on Wednesdays. I was parked at the gate by 11:40 always. Hazel would see my truck from the walkway and start moving before her teacher could catch her. She made a particular sound when she ran, not a scream, not a word, just a kind of open-throated joy that I have never heard from any other human being in my life. I learned to wait for it, the way you learn to wait for the first cool morning in September. You don't plan for it. You just stop what you're doing when it arrives. Wednesdays pick up the park on Ridgetop Circle when the weather cooperated, grilled cheese and tomato soup at my kitchen table. Fridays. Margot's book opened to whatever page Hazel chose, and she always chose by picture, never by name, her small hands pressing dough into shapes that never quite matched the cutters, flour on her forearms up to her elbows. I kept the 529 account, funded $650 every month, automated deposited on the first, not once delayed. I didn't mention it at family dinners. I didn't need Colton to say thank you. I deposited the money the same way I changed the oil in my truck, because neglecting it would have been a failure of character, and I wasn't willing to fail at that particular thing. In the spring of 2020, Colton called about the house in Ashburn. He and Celeste had found a place on a cul-de-sac near the school. The down payment was $95,000 beyond what they had. I told him I'd take care of it. I had Claudette draw up a promissory note, interest-free, no fixed schedule, payable at their own pace. Over the following 3 years, Colton sent 3 payments, $2,000 in November 2020, $1,500 in the spring of 2021, $1,000 sometime in late 2022. Total $4,500 returned out of $95,000 lent. I kept the note in the cedar chest in the garage. I did not bring it up at Christmas. I told myself the loan was an investment in Hazel's stability, and that stability was worth whatever it cost me. The credit card was Colton's idea in the fall of 2021, a temporary arrangement he said to manage some repairs around the house. I added him as an authorized user without much thought. Over the next 14 months, $4,200 moved through that card. 2 dinners I later recognized as the kind of restaurants where you don't bring your children golf at a course out near Dulles. A hotel charge in Richmond that appeared on a Tuesday and that I never asked about. I paid each statement in full. I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't worth the conversation. I know now that I was wrong about what it was worth. The drift when it began looked like nothing. In Hazel's 3rd year, Celeste started a Thursday morning class. The schedule needed to shift. Wednesdays and Fridays became Wednesdays only. I adjusted. I told myself it was temporary routines shift. When children grow, nothing about this was personal. The following autumn, Cordelia began spending longer stretches in Ashburn. She traveled south to Palm Beach in summer and returned north each September. And when she was in town, she was available too. Available and eager and living 12 minutes from the preschool, with a cleaner house and a newer kitchen and opinions about everything from car seats to the correct way to read picture books aloud. Wednesdays became every other Wednesday. Every other Wednesday became only when Cordelia was traveling. I did not argue. Each time the schedule changed, I found a reason not to say what I was actually thinking. I told myself I was being flexible. I told myself that Hazel was happy, and Hazel's happiness was the only measurement that mattered. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler and less comfortable, I was afraid. Not of Celeste, not of Cordelia. I was afraid of the conversation that might end with Hazel being kept from me entirely. So I kept quiet. I made myself smaller. I accepted each reduction in schedule the way you accept a smaller portion at the table, with enough grace that no one feels the need to apologize. I went from being a fixed point in Hazel's week to being an option, then from an option to a backup. And I let it happen, because every single time I considered saying something, I would look at Hazel's face, at the way she still reached for my hand in the parking lot, still pressed her nose against the garage window to watch me work, and I would decide that the argument wasn't worth what it might cost me. The problem with that logic is that it has no floor. You keep telling yourself the cost is worth it, and you keep accepting less. And eventually you look up and realize you have traded yourself down to almost nothing, and you did it so quietly that no one in the room even noticed it happening, including you. In the winter of that last year, I started drawing in my notebook again. Not blueprints, just layouts. A lawn, a carriage house, a string of lights between 2 oak trees. Morven Park in April. I had driven past it a dozen times over the years and thought someday. Hazel's 6th birthday felt like the right someday. I called the venue coordinator in early January and held a date. I started to list florals the caterer Howard had used for his daughter's graduation. The 3 recipes from Margot's book that I knew Hazel liked best. I spent evenings in the garage with wire cutters and silk flowers and a spool of ribbon, building something I couldn't quite name, yet a crown eventually, though it took 3 nights before it started to look like one. I spent $2,800 between the venue deposit and the materials. I didn't think of it as spending. I thought of it as finally doing something I should have done years ago. I called Colton on a Sunday in January and told him the plan. He said, "Dad, that sounds incredible." He said Hazel is going to love it. His voice had that particular warmth in it, the one I had been hearing since he was 8 years old, standing in the garage asking me if he could hand me the socket wrench. I believed every word of it. I know now exactly what that warmth was, and I know now when I stopped knowing the difference. 3 months later, on the morning of April 6th, my phone lit up at 6 a.m. with Colton's name on the screen. I reached for it the way you reach for something familiar. I answered before I thought about what answering might mean. I want to tell you about those 3 months, not because I want your sympathy, but because I want you to understand exactly what was sitting on my kitchen counter on the morning of April 6th. It started with a conversation at my kitchen table in January. Colton had brought Hazel over on a Saturday afternoon, one of the unscheduled visits that still happened occasionally, the kind that felt like gifts precisely because they weren't planned. I had made hot chocolate the real kind, with whole milk and a bar of dark chocolate I melted in a saucepan the way Margot used to. Hazel sat across from me with both hands wrapped around the mug, her chin barely clearing the table's edge, and I slid a notebook between us and told her we had some important decisions to make. She looked at the notebook, the way 6-year-olds look at anything official, with great seriousness and slightly furrowed brows. "What do you want your birthday party to look like?" I asked her. She didn't hesitate for even a second. "I want to be a princess grandpa, a real one." I looked at Colton. He was leaning against the counter with his coffee, smiling, the open, easy smile I remembered from when he was young, the one that used to mean he was genuinely happy and not managing anything. He gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "Go ahead, Dad." I turned back to Hazel. "Oh, then we're going to build you a kingdom," I said. She picked up the pen herself and drew a crown in the corner of the notebook page, lopsided with 5 points and a star on each one. I kept that page. It's still in the cedar chest. February moved fast the way planning months always do when you're working from a list. I drove out to Morven Park on a Wednesday morning in early February, one of those pale, cold days when Northern Virginia looks like it can't decide if winter is ending or just resting. The event coordinator walked me through the carriage house lawn, showed me where the string lights would run between the oak trees, explained the permit requirements for the small pony ride I had been considering. We signed the contract that afternoon, $1,200 for the venue. April 6th, exclusive use of the South Lawn from noon to 5. I found a floral artist in Leesburg who specialized in children's events, silk flowers, living walls, the kind of fairy garden arches you see in magazine spreads. She quoted $400 for the installation and breakdown. I said yes before she finished the sentence. A face painter out of Purcellville, $300, 2 hours unlimited designs. A local stable near Middleburg offered a miniature horse and a decorated cart for children's events, $500, 3 hours. The horse's name was Clover. I called the caterer Howard had used for his daughter's graduation 2 summers back. Finger sandwiches, fruit towers, lemonade, and glass pitchers, $400 for the spread. I found a seamstress in Ashburn who made children's costumes for school plays and local theater. I explained what I needed: 1 princess gown for Hazel, 10 smaller costume sashes and tiaras for the girls who would be attending. She asked me what colors. I told her Hazel liked pink and gold. She said she'd have them ready by the end of March. $200 for the full order. She tried to charge me more, and I talked her down, then tipped her the difference anyway because the work deserved it. Total outlay by the end of February, just over $2,800. That number has come up before in this story, and it will come up again. But I want to be precise about what it meant. It was not a comfortable sum for a retired man living on a fixed income and a pension that had never been designed for extravagance. It was not nothing. But when your granddaughter tells you she wants to be a real princess and looks at you with absolute confidence that you can make that happen, the number stops being a number. It becomes a measurement of something else entirely. March belonged to the crown. I had looked at the options craft stores online, vendors the kind of tiara you could order for $35 and have delivered in 2 days. I ordered nothing. Instead, I went to the supply shop on Market Street and bought silk petals and 4 shades of pink floral wire in 3 gauges, ribbon a headband base, and a small bottle of craft adhesive that the woman behind the counter told me was the best she carried. The first night I got the structure wrong. The second night I got the structure right, but the proportions were off. It looked more like a wreath than a crown. The third night, I sat at the workbench under the garage light from 8 in the evening until past midnight, and I built it the way I built everything that mattered, slowly. With attention, I didn't rush. With hands that had spent 40 years learning how to hold fragile things without breaking them. My fingers are not what they once were. The knuckles have thickened, The skin on the pads of my thumbs is calloused in the particular way of a man who has worked with tools his entire life. Threading silk petals onto wire with those hands required a patience that I had to choose again and again every time I fumbled. I chose it each time, because Hazel had drawn a lopsided crown in my notebook and told me she wanted to be a real princess. And I had told her I would build her a kingdom. And I do not make promises I intend to keep, only when they are convenient. The finished crown sat on the workbench for 3 days before I brought it inside. I checked it every morning the way you check something you're afraid to trust, looking for the flaw you might have missed. I never found one. The night before the party, I opened Margot's recipe book to page 43. Rose petal cake, her handwriting in blue ink at the top of the page and below it in pencil. The note she had added sometime in the 1990s, double the vanilla Colton always asks for more. The same cake she made for him every birthday until he was 12. The same recipe I had been circling for 3 months without letting myself start, because starting it felt like the final commitment, the moment after which everything was real and set and moving forward without the possibility of revision. I measured the flour, I softened the butter, I laid the dried petals in the bowl the way the recipe described, and I thought about the fact that Margot had stood in this same kitchen and done the same thing for a boy who was now a man of 41. Who was sitting somewhere in Ashburn that evening, probably thinking about tomorrow. I thought about Hazel's face when she saw the crown. I thought about Clover the miniature horse and the look on 10 little girls' faces when a horse walked through a fairy garden, wearing ribbon braids. I thought about the string lights between the oak trees at Morven Park and the way they would look just after 4 o'clock when the afternoon started going golden. I was on the second layer of frosting, maybe the third. That was when the phone rang. The first thing I noticed after that Monday was the silence. Not the lonely kind I had learned to live with since Margot died. Something different. Like a signal I had been receiving for years had finally stopped broadcasting, and I could hear my own frequency again. I didn't know what to do with it at first. The morning after I sent the certified letter, I woke at 5:15, the same time I had been waking for years. A body clock set by decades of early shop hours that never quite reset. I lay in bed for a few minutes, waiting for the familiar pull, the list, the schedule, the mental calculation of what needed doing before the day's first obligation arrived. Nothing came. There was no obligation. There was just a Tuesday morning in April and the sound of rain on the gutters above the bedroom window. I got up and made coffee. That was enough of a plan for the moment. The garage called me by mid-morning. I had a stack of white oak planks I had been saving for 2 years. Bought them from a salvage operation out near Purcellville when they were clearing an old farmhouse. Paid more than I should have, because white oak that age doesn't come along often, and I had not yet decided what they deserved to become. Standing in the garage that Tuesday morning, with my coffee going cold on the workbench, I decided. A cedar chest, not the one I built before Hazel was born. That one lived in the corner of my bedroom, now quiet and full. A new one, larger, with a different joinery technique I had been reading about for months, but never found the time to try. Dovetail corners cut by hand, not machine. The kind of work that demands your full attention for the duration, that will not allow your mind to wander. Because the moment it does, the chisel tells you so. I pulled out a sheet of paper and drew the dimensions. Then I picked up the marking gauge and started laying out the first board. My hands needed something to hold. That was the simple truth of it. 40 years of working with them had made them restless when they were idle. And restless hands in a quiet house are a particular kind of problem. The chest gave them purpose. It gave me something to come back to each morning. Something that was getting incrementally better each day. I returned to it, which is more than I could have said for most things in my life that spring. On Wednesday morning, I walked the river path. There's a trail along the Potomac, south of Leesburg, a wide gravel path that runs between the water and the tree line, flat enough for a man my age to cover 3 miles without regretting it. Populated in the early mornings by dog walkers and occasional runners who never look up from their shoes. I had driven past the trailhead hundreds of times over the years without stopping. There was always something else. A pickup to make an errand that couldn't wait, a schedule that had annexed my mornings, so gradually I had stopped noticing they were gone. That Wednesday I parked at the trailhead at 7 and walked south for 90 minutes. The river was running high from the spring rains. The tree line was in full early April green, that particular bright and almost yellow green that only lasts about 2 weeks before it deepens and settles into summer. I stopped twice, once to watch a great blue heron stand perfectly motionless in the shallows near the bank, once because my knee asked me to. Both times I stood still and listened to the water and thought about nothing specific. It was the first time in longer than I could accurately remember that I had stood somewhere and not been mentally somewhere else. I went back on Thursday and Friday. Howard called Thursday evening. "Poker group," he said, without preamble the way Howard always did, as if we had been in the middle of a conversation that simply paused for a while. "Wednesday nights, you keep saying you'll come." "Wednesdays work now," I said. There was a brief silence on his end. Then, "You doing all right?" "I think so," I said. "I think I might actually be." Howard had known me since 1987. He understood the difference between what I said and what I meant. And he was one of the very few people in my life who never pressed me to explain the gap. He said he'd see me Wednesday. I said I'd bring the bourbon. I went. 7 men around a folding table in Howard's finished basement. Bad poker, decent bourbon. A conversation that covered baseball and a road project on Route 15 and the particular brand of absurdity that comes with trying to age gracefully in a country that regards aging as a personal failure. I lost $22. I drove home at 10:30 with the windows down, the April air coming through cold and clean. I could not remember the last time I had stayed out on a Wednesday. Rosemary appeared at the door on Saturday with a container of chicken soup and the particular expression of a neighbor who has decided to check on you and is determined not to make it a production. "I made too much," she said. I told her I appreciated it. I made a fresh pot of coffee and she sat down at the kitchen table and we talked for an hour about her garden. She was putting in raised beds this year, had ordered heirloom tomato seedlings from a nursery in Charlottesville, and about the weather, and about a documentary she had seen on public television the previous week. She didn't ask me anything I didn't want to answer. That was the particular gift of Rosemary's company. She had an instinct for the shape of what someone needed, and she never pushed past its edges. When she left, I washed both cups and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the oak tree at the back of the yard, the one with the old tire swing that had been there since Colton was a boy. I kept waiting for the guilt to arrive, the feeling that I had done something I would need to walk back, something that would require an apology or a reversal, or at minimum, an uncomfortable reckoning with my own choices. I had been waiting for it since Monday morning. It hadn't come. What I felt instead was something I didn't have a clean word for. Uncomfortable in the way of an old coat you've taken off, a coat you'd worn so long you had forgotten it was a coat and thought it was just your skin. It felt like relief and also like exposure at the same time, and I was still deciding which was the more accurate description. Day 8, nothing from Colton. I finished the dovetail layout on the second board and called it an early night. Day 9, still quiet. I walked the Potomac Path at 7 and came home to toast and coffee and an hour with the newspaper. I could not remember the last time I had read a full newspaper on a weekday morning. Day 10. I fitted the first 2 corners of the chest. The joinery was cleaner than I had expected, given that I was attempting the technique for the first time with these particular hands at this particular age. I sat on the garage stool and looked at it for a long time. Margot would have had an opinion about the proportions. She always did. I could hear the opinion in a general way without being able to make out the exact words. That was usually how it went. On the 11th day, the phone rang. I was in the kitchen when it happened. I looked at the screen. Colton's name. I let it ring twice, not from indecision, but because I wanted to be standing still when I answered, not mid-motion, not with a tool in my hand. I set down the coffee mug. I picked up the phone. His voice when it came was tight, careful. The voice of a man who had spent nearly 2 weeks deciding what to say and had not landed on the right thing. He hadn't. I was grilling salmon on the back porch when the call came in. The baseball game was on the radio, an early season match, the Nationals down by 2 in the 6th. The announcer's voice floating out through the screen door with that particular evening game cadence that has always made me feel like time is moving at the right speed. The April air was cool enough that I had put on the fleece jacket, the old green one I've had since the shop days, The salmon had another 4 minutes. I turned down the grill flame and picked up the phone. Colton. Dad! His voice was tight from the first syllable. Not the careful tight of callback. This was a different register. Prepared. What is this letter? It's a demand for repayment of the $90,500 you owe me. You're doing this now, after a birthday party. This has nothing to do with the party. You signed a legal document. You've made 4 payments in 3 years. A breath on his end. Then the pivot I had been expecting. The move toward the sympathetic detail. The human scale explanation meant to make the number feel cruel. We're stretched right now. Celeste is redoing the kitchen, and we just bought the Range Rover. You bought a $67,000 vehicle, I said. My voice was level. I had decided sometime in the 11 days between sending the letter and this phone call that I was not going to shout. Shouting is what you do when you're not sure you're right. I was sure. You bought a $67,000 vehicle and you haven't sent me $1,500 in 14 months. Silence. Not a short silence. The kind that has weight, the kind that means the person on the other end is deciding whether to apologize or to escalate. I had worked with enough people over 40 years to know which direction that particular silence was leaning. Dad, this is going to cause serious problems. I'm not the one who created the problems, Colton. I'm just the one who stopped pretending they don't exist. Another silence. Then a sound I couldn't quite categorize, not quite a word, not quite a dismissal. Something in the middle. I need you to think about what you're doing to this family. I have thought about it, I said. I've had 11 days and a lot of quiet mornings. I've thought about almost nothing else. My answer is the same as it was on Monday. He hung up. I stood on the back porch with the phone in my hand and listened to the radio. The Nationals had left 2 men on base. The salmon was about ready. I flipped the salmon. I had just started plating it when the phone rang again. Different name this time. Celeste. Roland. Her voice had the quality of a woman who had spent 10 minutes being very angry and had decided to lead with something that sounded like composure. This is completely unacceptable. Good evening, Celeste. You are going to destroy your relationship with your son over money. My relationship with my son was damaged long before this. I just wasn't honest enough with myself to see it clearly. I heard her exhale the short, controlled kind that means someone is deciding whether to change tactics. She changed tactics. This was a family decision. Colton and I made it together. You need to respect that. I've respected a great many decisions I wasn't part of making, I said. I've been respecting them quietly for years. Right now I'm making some decisions of my own. You think this makes you look strong. Her voice shifted something harder underneath, now less managed. Going after your son, legally sending lawyers letters to your grandchild's home? I didn't send it to Hazel's home, I said. I sent it to Colton's address. There's a difference, and I think you know that. A pause. Then when she came back, if you keep acting this way, you're gonna die alone. I let that one sit between us for a moment. It was designed to land somewhere tender, the old man, the empty house, the missing family. 10 years ago, it might have worked. It might have made me apologize for something I hadn't done wrong. I considered the salmon on the plate. I considered the oak tree at the back of the yard. I considered Margot's handwriting on page 43 of her recipe book. Maybe, I said, but I'll die, knowing I finally acted like a man who had some self-respect. That's more than I could have said 6 months ago. She hung up. I put the phone face down on the patio table. I brought the salmon and a glass of water to the table and sat down and ate while the radio played. The Nationals came back in the 8th on a 2-run single. The announcer sounded pleased about it. The April dark came in slowly from the tree line, the way spring evenings do in Virginia, not arriving so much as accumulating. The light draining in increments until you look up and realize it's been gone for a while without your noticing. I washed the plate. I put the leftover salmon in a container in the refrigerator. I sat in the garage for an hour with the cedar chest joinery and a marking gauge. Not because I had specific work to do, but because the garage had always been the room where I thought most clearly. Margot used to say I went to the garage the way other men went to church. She didn't mean it as a criticism. She understood that the workbench was where I processed things, where my hands could do something useful, while the rest of me sorted through whatever needed sorting. I sorted through the phone calls. The thing about Celeste's line, "You'll die alone," was not that it was cruelty I had expected. The thing was that she said it as if it were a consequence I had failed to calculate, as if I had left it off my ledger by oversight, as if the loneliness of old age were a threat instead of a condition that most men in my position had already made their peace with. I had made mine. Somewhere around the 4th or 5th year of widowhood, you stop fearing the empty house and start learning its acoustics. You learn which silences are peaceful and which ones are the other kind. You learn to tell the difference. You also learn, and this is the part no one tells you before you get there, that there are people in your life whose presence has been filling a silence that was actually already okay. That the noise you were tolerating as connection was not connection at all. It was just noise. And when it stops, what you feel is not grief. What you feel is the absence of a low-grade pain you had been living with so long you'd categorized it as normal. That was what I was sitting with in the garage that night. Not the anger of the calls, not Celeste's words. The realization that the silence of the last 11 days had been cleaner than anything I'd felt in years, and that 2 phone calls from people who needed me to feel bad about that had not changed it. My hands were steady. The joinery on the cedar chest was coming together better than I had expected. In the 2 weeks that followed, Colton went completely quiet. No calls, no messages, no photographs of Hazel sent through to my phone, the kind he used to send occasionally, usually without context. Hazel at a soccer game, or Hazel holding something she'd found in the yard. Those had always been his version of an olive branch, small and low cost. They had stopped. That part did hurt. I want to be accurate about that. Not the silence from Colton I had expected. It understood its logic. Could read it as clearly as I could read a stress fracture in a drive shaft. But the absence of Hazel's face on my phone was a different kind of quiet, and I won't pretend it wasn't. I had learned something a long time ago in that garage, though. Back when I was still taking apart engines that other men had given up on. The thing that's actually broken is always the thing you least want to look at directly. You can spend a long time adjusting everything around it, compensating, making the other parts work harder to cover for the one that won't. Eventually, you run out of workarounds. The only way through is to look directly at what's broken and call it by its name. I had called it by its name. Now I waited to see what would answer back. Before this goes where it's about to go. Comment justice if you've been waiting for this moment. 30 days of silence. One Tuesday morning. Roland was done waiting. Quick note, parts of this story include fictional elements for storytelling purposes. If that's not your thing, it's okay to step away here. 30 days passed. No payment arrived at Claudette's office. No call, no letter, nothing at all. I drove downtown on a Tuesday morning and sat across from her desk. The office smelled like old paper and good coffee. Claudette had a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand. She looked at me the way she always looked at clients who had already made up their minds with attention rather than persuasion. "File the suit," I said. She wrote something on the pad. Then she looked up. Loudoun County Circuit Court. $90,500, that number, is well above the small claims threshold, Roland. Once we file it, becomes public record. Anyone can look it up. "File it." She held the pen still for a moment. Not hesitation, assessment. This will land on his doorstep. Literally. Sheriff's deputy in person in front of his neighbors. I understand how service of process works. 3 seconds. Then she turned to her computer and began pulling up the filing portal for Loudoun County Circuit Court. "I'll have the complaint drafted by end of day," she said. "We'll file tomorrow morning." 3 days later, Claudette called. The deputy served him this morning at the Ashburn House, 8:15 a.m. I didn't ask for more detail. I knew the layout of that cul-de-sac well enough. Houses close together, driveways visible from the street. Neighbors who walked their dogs at 8 and knew everyone's cars. A sheriff's deputy in uniform at the front door was not something that disappeared quietly into that particular neighborhood. "He's not contesting it," Claudette said. "Excuse me, Colton's not going to fight it. His attorney reached out this morning. They want a consent judgment." I sat with that for a moment. A consent judgment meant Colton had looked at the promissory note, understood that my case was straightforward, and made a calculation. Fighting it would cost money and produce the same result. Agreeing would produce the same result faster. Once the consent judgment is entered, Claudette said, I file the judgment line against the Ashburn property the same day. Automatically. His title is encumbered until the debt is satisfied. Do it, I said. The consent judgment was entered on a Friday afternoon. Claudette's message came through while I was in the garage, 3 sentences factual clean. Judgment entered. Leon filed with Loudoun County Land Records. His title is encumbered effective today. In Virginia, a judgment line attaches to every parcel of real property the debtor owns in the county where it's recorded. It stays there visible on any title search, blocking any refinance or sale until the judgment is satisfied or the court orders otherwise. The Range Rover didn't matter. The kitchen renovation didn't matter. The lien was a fact now, and it would remain a fact until $90,500 was accounted for. I set down the phone and picked up the sandpaper. He came on a Monday morning, 8 a.m. I heard the car in the driveway before I saw it, the particular engine note of a vehicle that costs more than it should. I set down my coffee and went to the front door. Colton looked the way a man looks when he hasn't slept well in several weeks. Eyes red at the rims, shirt wrinkled in the way that means it was worn the day before and put back on. He was 41 years old and standing on my front porch with the expression of a man who finally understood that his choices had consequences. Behind him in the driveway, the Range Rover idled. Celeste was in the passenger seat, arms crossed, eyes forward. She did not look at the house. Dad. The careful management from the phone calls was gone. What was left was simpler. You have to do something about this lien. We're trying to refinance, get a lower rate, and the title search flagged it. The bank won't proceed. I know how judgment lines work, Colton. This is insane. You're my father. I stepped back from the door. Come inside. He followed me to the kitchen. I sat down at the table. I did not offer him a chair, not from cruelty, but because I needed to say what I was about to say without the softening that hospitality implies. I came to the party, Colton. He went still. I stood inside that gate for 20 minutes. I watched Hazel spin in her dress. I watched you laugh with your father-in-law. No one asked me to leave. No one even noticed I was there. I kept my voice level. That told me everything I needed to know. The change in his face was small but real, the particular shift of a man who has just learned that the thing he thought he controlled was witnessed. He didn't say anything. Outside, the Range Rover horn sounded once short sharp. I'm giving Claudette 60 days to work out a payment arrangement, I said. A structured plan, something both parties can sign off on. If I don't hear back with a proposal, I'll proceed with enforcement. Colton looked at me for a moment. Then he turned and walked out, down the steps, across the driveway, into the Range Rover without looking back. The car reversed and turned and was gone. I stood on the porch until I couldn't hear the engine anymore. That evening, I went back to the cedar chest. I picked up the sandpaper and worked the interior panels, the surfaces that would never be seen once the lid was closed, but that I would know were there. I had always finished hidden surfaces with the same care as visible ones. The standard was mine, not the observer's. But my mind kept returning to Colton's face. I had expected denial. I had prepared for it, decided in advance that his denial wouldn't change anything. The point of saying it was to make clear that I knew that the pretense was finished, that we were in the same reality now, whether he acknowledged it or not. What I hadn't prepared for was what I actually saw. It wasn't remorse. Remorse looks like a man trying to hold something together. What I saw was the opposite, the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had just been told he could set it down. Relief, faint, quickly covered, but real. That told me more than any admission would have. It told me he had known somewhere under all of it that the way things had been going was wrong. The weight he'd been carrying wasn't only the debt or the lien, it was the cost of maintaining a version of events he didn't entirely believe himself. I filed that away the same way I finished the hidden panels carefully without announcing it, because the things you notice quietly are often the ones that matter most when the time finally comes to understand what actually happened. After Colton left that morning, I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house had a particular kind of quiet to it, The quiet of a place where something important has just happened and the air hasn't settled yet. The coffee on the counter had gone cold. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the oak tree, cycling through 4 or 5 different songs, with the mechanical dedication of a bird that has nowhere else to be. I listened to it for a while. Then I got up and went out to the garage. Margot's chair was still there. It had always been there, a low wooden rocker she had brought out sometime in the early 90s, the year Colton was 7 or 8, and had started spending Saturday mornings in the garage with me. She had set it in the corner near the small window where the light came in, good in the afternoon, and she would sit there with a book or a cup of tea and watch the two of us work. She said she wasn't interested in engines. What she was interested in, she told me once, was watching people who were good at something be good at it together. She stopped coming out as often when Colton got older, and the Saturday mornings stopped, but the chair stayed. I sat down in it now. It was lower than I remembered, or I was stiffer than I used to be, more likely. I settled into it and looked at the wall above the workbench. 2 photographs up there in frames I'd put up years ago. The first Margot at the county fair, sometime in the mid-'80s, laughing at something outside the frame, her hair pushed back by the wind. The second Colton at 8 years old, standing next to a bicycle we'd spent most of a Saturday repairing a second-hand 10-speed with a bent derailleur and 3 broken spokes that he'd found at the church sale for $4. His hands were black with grease to the wrist. He was grinning the way children grin when they've done something real with their hands for the first time and understand, in their body before their mind catches up, that this is something they are capable of. I looked at that photograph for a long time. You would have seen this coming, Margot. I said it out loud the way I had been saying things out loud in this garage for 10 years. Not performance, not prayer exactly, just the habit of a man who had talked to his wife for 34 years and found that the habit didn't stop when she did. Years ago. You always did. She had too. That was the honest thing about it. There had been moments, early moments before Celeste, even when Margot had said things I hadn't wanted to hear. Small observations, never accusations. Colton expects things to be easier than they are. He gets frustrated when they aren't, and he looks for someone to solve it. She had said it gently the way she said most things. Not as a verdict, but as a fact she was offering, in case I found it useful. I had not found it useful. I had said something about all kids being like that, and she had looked at me with the particular expression she kept for occasions when she was deciding whether to press the point. She hadn't pressed it. She usually didn't with me. She trusted that I would get there eventually. I thought I was protecting him, I said to the photograph. That's what I told myself. Every loan, every payment, every month, I didn't say anything. I was protecting him. I looked at the grease-black hands the 8-year-old grin. But I was protecting myself from having to admit what I already knew. The mockingbird outside had moved on to a new section of its repertoire. A cardinal somewhere in the yard answered it briefly, then went quiet. What I had known, what I had been not knowing for years with some effort, was that the boy in the photograph and the man who had stood in my kitchen that morning were not as different as I had wanted them to be. The boy had been wonderful, genuinely wonderful, curious and funny, and capable of a kind of focused attention when something interested him. That reminded me of the best version of myself at that age. But even then there had been something, a tendency to drift when the work got difficult, a way of looking toward the exit before the problem was fully solved. I had always found reasons to explain it. Boys will be boys. He'll grow out of it. He just needs time, more confidence, a better situation. He had needed something that was true. I was no longer sure that what I had given him was it. I didn't set out to cry. I was sitting in Margot's chair looking at a photograph of a child who no longer existed. And then I was crying, and I'm not sure exactly when the one became the other. Not for myself. I want to be clear about that. It would be easy to let grief settle into self-pity, and I had spent 10 years learning to tell the difference. This was not about what had been done to me. This was for the 8-year-old with the grease-black hands who had been genuinely good at fixing things, who had stood in this garage on a Saturday morning with his whole future still uncomplicated, and who had somewhere along the way stopped believing that doing things the hard way was worth it. I didn't know when that had happened. I didn't know if it was Celeste's influence or Reginald's money or something that had always been present waiting for the right conditions to take hold. I didn't know how much of it was mine to carry, how much I had contributed by making it too easy for too long. I sat in Margot's chair and let myself feel all of it without trying to categorize it. That was the other thing she had taught me, that some things don't need to be filed away immediately. Some things just need to be felt until they're done. In the weeks that followed, the payments began to arrive. The first one came on a Tuesday, $2,200 transferred directly to the account Claudette had specified in the payment arrangement. No note, no call. The number appeared in my account the way a utility payment appears: functional, impersonal, correct. I did not call Colton. Colton did not call me. The money moved between us like a transaction between strangers, which I was beginning to understand was closer to the truth than either of us had been willing to say for a long time. The debt existed. The payment plan existed. The lien existed. These were the structures we had agreed to operate within, and we were both operating within them. And there was a kind of clarity to that, which I had not expected to find comforting. But clarity about money is a narrow thing. It tells you what the numbers are. It doesn't tell you what the silence means, or whether the silence is grief or anger, or simply two people who have run out of things to say that aren't about money. The money moved. Everything else did not. 2 weeks after Colton left my house, Claudette called. The payment plan was holding. That was the first thing she said, and it was the thing I had expected her to say. But then she mentioned something else, something she had heard through the particular network of information that flows between lawyers and the people who know lawyers in a county the size of Loudoun. Something that had apparently moved from Ashburn to McLean. And from McLean, it seemed it had changed certain things considerably. She didn't have the full story, but what she had was enough to tell me that what happened next was not going to be quiet. Claudette called on a Thursday afternoon. The payment plan was real, $2,200 a month, 44 months. The first check had cleared. She led with that, the way she always led with the fact before the context. And I appreciated it. Then she told me what she had heard from Colton's attorney, something that had happened at the Harrington house in McLean. I sat down at the kitchen table and listened. When the civil suit became public record, Reginald had moved quickly. That was the word Claudette used, quickly, and I understood what it meant. Reginald Harrington was a man who had spent his life managing situations before they became visible to people who mattered. A lawsuit filed against his son-in-law in Loudoun County Circuit Court was in his calculation a situation that required managing. He summoned Colton to McLean. The meeting was at the dining room table, the good one, Claudette's phrasing, passed through from Colton's attorney, the formal table in the room they used for occasions that required a certain kind of weight. Cordelia was there. Celeste was there. Reginald sat at the head. This is what happens, Reginald said. When you can't manage your own affairs, we'll retire the debt. You'll sign a family financial agreement oversight of your accounts. Co-signature on expenditures above a threshold. We handle it cleanly, and this goes away. Claudette paused in her telling. I waited. Colton had looked at Celeste. Celeste had looked at the table, not at her husband at the table. Not a word, not a gesture. The woman who had told me I would die alone did not open her mouth in that room to say a single thing on behalf of the man she had married. Colton stood up. I'll handle my own debt. And he walked out. What happened to Celeste's share of the obligation was settled separately. The promissory note had carried both their names, but when the consent judgment was entered, Colton's attorney had made it explicit. Colton was assuming full responsibility for the outstanding balance as part of the divorce settlement. Celeste signed off on that transfer of liability. Claudette confirmed it in writing. Whatever Celeste owed me legally, she had handed to Colton, and Colton had accepted it. The line sat between me and Claudette for a moment. His attorney told me, she said with a careful precision I recognized as her way of underlining something, that it was the first time Colton had ever left that house without asking permission first. I didn't say anything right away. I was looking at the window above the kitchen sink, the one that faces the backyard, the oak tree, the old tire swing moving slightly in the afternoon breeze. Good for him, I said, and I meant it. Not as a performance of generosity, not as the thing you say to seem reasonable when you're still angry. I meant it the way you mean something, when it surprises you when a person you had been in the process of writing off does something that makes you stop writing. It was the first thing Colton had done in years that I genuinely respected. Claudette had one more thing. Colton insisted on handling the debt himself. Wouldn't hear of Reginald paying it. His attorney was clear about that. Colton was specific. And apparently Hazel said something to her parents recently about a special piece of paper with her name on it. I kept my voice even. Let him figure it out, I said. What Hazel had found or seen or overheard in the way children absorbed the edges of adult conversations was the document I had revised in the weeks after sending the demand letter. My will. The version that left the house, the land, the contents of the accounts, and whatever remained of the business holdings directly to Hazel in trust, administered by Claudette's firm until Hazel turned 25. Colton's name appeared once in the section that explained the reasoning, and not in the beneficiary lines. I had not done it as punishment. I want to be precise about that. I had done it because I finally understood what Margot had meant when she said, "Take care of our boy," that she had meant the boy she hoped he would grow into, not the arrangement I had been maintaining in his name. The trust for Hazel was not a message to Colton. It was a correction of something I should have set right years earlier. Whether Colton understood that distinction was his work to do, not mine. Howard called 2 days later. He had heard things through the channels that flow between the connected people of a small county. A friend of a friend. A conversation at the kind of lunch that generates information the way a good fire generates heat. He called because he knew I would want to know, and because he was Howard, which meant he delivered it the same way he delivered everything, directly without ornamentation, and with the particular care of a man who had been your friend long enough to understand the difference between information and cruelty. Celeste had been talking to a divorce attorney. The conversations had apparently started in the 2 weeks following the McLean meeting. Howard's source was not in the room. The information had a chain of custody that included at least 2 intermediaries, but it had the texture of something real, the kind of specific detail that doesn't survive fabrication. I listened to him tell it. I thanked him. After I hung up, I sat with the information for a while. I did not feel satisfied. I want to record that accurately because it would be easy to write a version of this, where the news of Celeste's pending departure registers as justice delivered, as the completion of an equation. That is not what I felt. What I felt was closer to the feeling you have when you turn out to have been right about something you wished you'd been wrong, about a tiredness rather than a triumph. A recognition that the outcome you predicted is not always the outcome you wanted. Celeste had said what she said to me on the back porch because she believed it, because the particular architecture of her worldview made it true or true enough. That was its own kind of sadness, not the kind that requires my sympathy, but the kind that sits in the room with you for a while before it leaves. The payments kept arriving. On the first of each month, $2,200 moved from Colton's account to the one Claudette had specified, and I watched the balance of what he owed slowly become a different number. It was a reliable and personal rhythm, the rhythm of an obligation being met by a man who had finally decided to meet it on his own terms. The calls did not come. The silence between us had its own shape, now not hostile exactly, but not warm. The silence of 2 people who have said the important things and are waiting to find out what comes after. Somewhere in that silence, I began to think with some seriousness about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. Not the financial structure of it, Claudette had that in hand. The other part. The part that had been occupied for years by schedules that were not mine, and arrangements I had agreed to without being asked. I had some ideas. A few of them surprised me. There is a difference between no longer being someone's ATM and actually building something of your own. In June, I finally understood the difference. I drove to Nova on a Tuesday morning. The Loudown campus sits off of Waxpool Road, a low, spread-out complex of brick buildings and parking lots that looks from the outside like most community colleges in Northern Virginia, practical. Unglamorous design for people who are serious about getting somewhere, rather than people who are serious about the aesthetic of getting there. Margot had loved it. She had enrolled in the art program 12 years before she died, and kept going back semester after semester, long after she had learned what most students came to learn. She went because she liked the teachers and liked being in rooms where people were trying to make something out of nothing. She used to come home with paint on her forearms and talk about color theory for 20 minutes while I tried to follow. I never managed to follow. I always listened anyway. The scholarship office was in the administrative building on the east side of campus. A woman named Patricia, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the efficient manner of someone who has handled many unusual requests and found most of them workable, sat across from me and listened while I explained what I wanted. An annual scholarship. Visual arts students. Named for Margot Mercer. The first award to be given in the fall of 2024 with subsequent awards in perpetuity, funded through a restricted account I would establish through Claudette's office. I had the initial funding amount written on a notepad, enough to cover tuition supplies, and a modest living stipend for one student per year. Not a large number by the standards of institutional philanthropy, large enough to matter to the person who received it. Patricia took notes. She asked a few questions about the selection criteria, about whether I wanted any role in the review process, about the naming conventions for the certificate. I told her I wanted the full name on everything the Margot Mercer Scholarship for Visual Arts. She wrote it down exactly as I said it. We shook hands in the parking lot 40 minutes later. 3 weeks later, Claudette confirmed that the foundation had been formally registered as a charitable trust under Virginia law. Simple structure, restricted purpose, her firm listed as administrator. The paperwork I had submitted in May was now complete. The Margot Mercer Foundation existed on paper the way it had already existed in everything else. I sat in the truck for a while before I started the engine. The campus was quiet on a Tuesday morning in June. A few students crossing the lot with backpacks, a grounds worker running a trimmer along the edge of a walkway. The sound of a distant lawnmower carrying through the warm air. Ordinary. The kind of scene that doesn't ask anything of you and doesn't offer anything in particular, which is sometimes exactly what you need. Margot had walked across this parking lot 100 times. More. She had parked in lots just like this one and carried her supply bag in through doors just like those doors and sat in rooms I had never seen and learned things she brought home to tell me. I had been 45 minutes away the whole time. I had never once come to see the place that mattered to her. I was not going to punish myself for that. I had made a decision years ago, in my own way, to be the kind of husband who supported things he didn't fully understand, and I had kept it. But sitting in that parking lot, I understood for the first time that supporting something and being present for it are two different things, and that I had always been better at the first than the second. The scholarship was not an apology. You cannot apologize to someone who is no longer there to receive it. It was something else, a way of making her name mean something in a room she had actually cared about, attached to a person who needed what she had once needed, and might do something real with it. That felt right. Not triumphant, right. Howard called that evening around 7. I was on the back porch with a glass of water, and the last of the day's light coming in, flat and golden through the oak tree. He had heard something through the same channels. He always heard things. And he called because he always called when he thought I should know. Celeste had gone to Reginald and Cordelia. After the divorce conversations had become real, after whatever happened in the weeks following the McLean meeting had settled into decisions, she had gone to her parents looking for the kind of support that the Harrington household had always provided as a matter of course. Money specifically, a cushion while things were sorted out. Reginald had said no. Howard's source had it in almost these exact words. You made this problem. You solve it. The Range Rover, the $67,000 vehicle that had appeared in my driveway on a Monday morning in May while Colton stood on my porch in a wrinkled shirt, was listed for sale. I listened to Howard tell it. I waited until he was finished. Thank you for telling me, Howard, I said. He paused for a moment. He knew me well enough to know what I wasn't saying, and to understand that what I wasn't saying was not ingratitude, but something more complicated. You doing all right? He asked. I think so, I said, more or less. After we hung up, I sat with the news for a while. I had expected something like this, The logic of it was not difficult to follow, and I had followed it weeks earlier. Expecting something and having it arrive are different, though. There is always a gap between the calculation and the fact, and the gap is where the feeling lives. I did not feel satisfaction. I want to record that clearly because it would be easy to assume otherwise. What I felt was the particular weariness of watching consequences arrive for people you once loved. The sense that the right thing and the good thing are not always the same thing. And that being correct offers less comfort than you imagine it will when you are in the middle of being wronged. The oak tree moved in the evening breeze. I finished the water and went inside. The cedar chest was nearly done. 2 months of evenings working an hour here and 2 hours there. The kind of project that doesn't demand your full attention for long stretches, but rewards consistency. The dovetail corners were clean and dry. The white oak had taken the finish well. A light oil, the kind that brings out the grain without darkening it, that lets the wood look like what it actually is. The hinges were fitted. The interior panels were sanded smooth to the touch. I had not yet decided what to put inside it. That felt right too. Some things should stay empty for a while. Empty is not the same as unfinished. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Northern Virginia Community College. The envelope was standard issue, the kind that comes in boxes of 500. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, in the particular careful cursive of someone who had been taught that handwriting to a stranger requires more effort than handwriting to someone you know. Her name was Destiny. She was studying graphic design. She wanted eventually to design educational materials for children who learned the way she had learned, not easily, not quickly, but stubbornly and with a great deal of help from the right people at the right time. The Margot Mercer Scholarship, she wrote, meant she did not have to choose between tuition and rent. I read the letter 4 times. Then I walked to the kitchen and set it on the windowsill beside Margot's recipe book, the one with the handwriting in the margins, the pencil corrections, the small stars beside the recipes Colton had loved. The letter leaned against the spine of the book in the afternoon light. It looked like it had always been there. I was sanding the lid of the cedar chest on a Saturday afternoon in September when I heard tires on the gravel. A car I didn't recognize turned into the driveway. I set down the sandpaper. It was a used Honda, the kind of practical, unremarkable vehicle that a man buys when he is no longer buying cars to impress anyone. I noticed that first before I noticed the man stepping out of it. The Range Rover was gone. I had heard as much from Howard weeks earlier. What I hadn't expected was how much smaller everything would look without it. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. The kind of clothes he used to wear in college before the life he built with Celeste came with a dress code. His eyes were dark underneath. The particular darkness that comes not from one bad night, but from several weeks of them stacked together. He looked like a man who had lost a long fight and was still figuring out how to stand up straight in the aftermath. He stopped at the garage door. He didn't speak immediately. He stood there and watched me for a full minute, watched my hands moving on the wood, watched the light come in through the side window, the way it always does in September, low and sideways. The kind of light that makes everything in the garage look like it's been there longer than it has. I kept working. I had learned somewhere in the years of running a shop that some conversations need a minute of quiet before they're ready to begin. Then he spoke. Celeste and I are done. Filing is in process. She has Hazel during the week staying at her parents' place. I'm in Ashburn. Still at the house, I went back to project management consulting. 3 contracts since June, steady enough to cover the mortgage and the monthly payments while things get sorted out. I set the sandpaper down on the workbench. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. No, you're not. I looked at him directly. I am, actually. I never wanted your marriage to fail. Whatever happened between you and me, I didn't want that to be the outcome for Hazel. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he stepped into the garage. He moved to the wall above the workbench, the way people move toward things they're not sure they want to look at, but can't avoid. The photograph of himself at 8 years old, grease-black hands. The second-hand 10-speed bicycle, the grin of a boy who had just fixed something real and knew it. He looked at it the way adults look at photographs of themselves as children, like studying someone they used to know well and have since lost track of. I remember that day, Fatai said. You let me do the whole thing myself. You just sat there and watched. You didn't need my help, I said. You needed me to be there." He put his hand flat against the wall beside the frame, not touching the photograph itself, just near it. "Hazel keeps asking when she can visit you. She talks about the flower crown." A pause. "The one she never got." I put my hand on the workbench to steady myself. Not visibly, I didn't let it show. But I needed something solid under my palm for a moment, and the workbench was there. He turned and looked at me directly. It was the first time in longer than I could accurately calculate that he had done it without managing what his face was doing, without the careful, arranged neutrality I had been reading for years as composure, and had only recently understood was something else entirely. "She made me feel like you weren't enough." His voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the shaking has already been done somewhere private. "Like where you came from? What you built with your hands, it wasn't the right kind. And I believed her because it was easier than standing up to her, easier than admitting what I was doing to you." The garage was quiet. Outside, a late September wind moved through the oak tree, the dry, papery sound of leaves that have started making their decision about letting go. "The night of the party," he said. "When you told me you'd been there, I didn't deny it. I could have, but I didn't. I want you to know that wasn't an accident. I had been carrying that for months, maybe longer. There's a certain kind of relief in being caught that you can't manufacture any other way." He stopped. Then the last part, quieter. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't have the right to ask that. I just needed you to know that I know what I did." I didn't say anything. I walked to the mini fridge in the corner, the old one I've had since the shop days, still running, still reliable in the way that things are reliable when nobody has asked too much of them. I took out 2 cans of beer, handed him one. He took it without a word. We carried the chairs out the 2 old wooden ones Margot used to pull up when she came to watch me work. The ones that have been in the corner of the garage since the early 90s and will probably be there long after I'm gone. We set them in the open garage door facing the backyard. The September afternoon was going golden across the Loudoun County sky, the light spreading flat and warm over the oak tree and the tire swing and the long grass at the back of the yard that I keep meaning to cut and never quite get to. We sat and we drank and we didn't talk much. Some silences between a father and a son are the wrong kind, the kind built from avoidance from things unsaid that should have been said years earlier. This one was different. This one had the quality of 2 people who had finally said the necessary things and were now simply present with each other in the aftermath, which is its own kind of language. I did not forgive him that evening. I want to be honest about that. Forgiveness is not something you hand across because someone finally found the right words. It has to be built the way you build a cedar chest, dovetail by dovetail, with attention and patience and the understanding that the thing you're making will only hold if every joint is sound. It takes longer than one September afternoon. It takes more than 2 cans of beer and a confession that cost him something real, but still cost me more. What I gave him that evening was presence. The same thing he had needed from me when he was 8 years old and working on a bicycle, and I had understood without being able to explain it. That staying in the room was the whole job. I had stayed in the room then. I stayed in the room now. Sometimes that is where things begin. Before he left, he stopped on the porch steps. "Is there any chance I could bring Hazel by sometime?" "Okay, I'll check the tire swing," I said. "Make sure the rope is still good." He nodded once, got into the Honda, backed down the driveway without looking at the house, turned onto Sycamore Ridge Road, and was gone. I stood on the porch until I couldn't hear the engine anymore. Then I went around the side of the house to the oak tree and put both hands on the tire swing and tested the rope. Pulling down on it, hard feeling, for give or fray or any sign of weakness. The rope was fine. It had always been fine. But some things you need to check with your own hands before you can say so and mean it. That Saturday morning came faster than I expected. And what happened when that car turned into the driveway, I was not prepared for it. You never are with a 6-year-old. You think you will be. You check the rope, you clear the workbench. You tell yourself you're ready. You are never ready. She was out of the car before Colton cut the engine. 6 years old, running up the driveway, like she had somewhere very important to be, which she did. No hesitation at the door. No looking back at her father. No moment of adjustment between the car and the world outside it. Just movement pure and certain, the way children move when they haven't yet learned to second-guess where they belong. She hit me at full speed with both arms out. "Grandpa, I missed you so much." I caught her the way you catch something you've been waiting for. Without knowing how long you've been waiting, I held on. Closed my eyes for just a moment, long enough to feel the weight of her against my chest. The particular warmth of a 6-year-old who has been running and is slightly out of breath and doesn't notice either of those things because she is too busy being exactly where she wants to be. "I missed you too, Hazelbug," I said into the top of her head. "More than you'll ever know." She smelled like the same shampoo she'd always used, something with a cartoon animal on the label that I'd never been able to identify. I held on a few seconds longer than was strictly necessary. Then I set her down and looked up. Colton was standing at the end of the driveway, hands in his jacket pockets, weight back slightly on his heels, the posture of a man who has made a decision and is holding himself to it. He didn't move toward the house. He gave me a small nod, not the careful managed nod from months ago, but something simpler and less rehearsed. And then he leaned against the hood of the Honda and looked at his phone. He'd wait out front. That was the arrangement without either of us having said it. This part belonged to Hazel and me. I took her hand, and we walked around the side of the house to the backyard. The tire swing was the first thing she saw. She was across the yard before I finished saying her name. She grabbed the rim with both hands and looked back at me with an expression that was equal parts request and announcement. "Push me, Grandpa. High." I pushed her high. She screamed every time the arc peaked, not the scream of fear, but the scream of someone who wants the feeling to be bigger than it is and is using volume to make that happen. I kept pushing. My shoulder reminded me around the 4th or 5th pass that I was 68 years old. I kept pushing anyway. Some things are worth the reminder. Between the screaming and the laughing, there were brief moments when she was simply quiet, dragging her sneakers through the dirt at the bottom of the arc, looking up at the oak canopy, thinking whatever 6-year-olds think about when they are momentarily still. During one of those moments, she asked me something. I gave her the best answer I had. She thought about it for a moment, then went forward again and forgot about it entirely, or seemed to. Children are like that. They ask the thing that matters most and then move on. And you're the one left standing there, still holding the question long after they've swung away from it. She followed me into the garage after. The cedar chest was on the workbench, the lid nearly finished, the white oak grain smooth and pale in the afternoon light. She found the safety goggles on the hook by the door before I could say anything about them. They were designed for a man my size. On her face, they slid halfway down her nose and gave her the look of a scientist who had misplaced her prescription. She wore them for 45 minutes without complaint. She helped me work the finishing cloth along the lid in careful circles, applying the kind of focused and methodical attention that children only produce when they have decided that something is serious and worth doing properly. "What's it for?" she asked, not looking up from the wood. "Keeping important things safe." "Like what?" "I haven't decided yet." She processed this with a small nod, the nod of someone who finds the answer satisfactory precisely because it is honest. Then she went back to the finishing cloth. I watched her hands on the wood and thought about things I did not say out loud. We grilled hot dogs on the back porch when the lights started going sideways. She talked without pause about her teacher, about a girl named Britt, whose dog knew 3 tricks and whose hamster knew 1. About something that happened at lunch that was apparently very funny and that I only partially followed. I listened to all of it. Every word, every digression, every sentence that started in one direction and ended somewhere completely different. I had missed the sound of it more than I had let myself know. By the time the sky went full gold and flat across the yard, she was done talking. She went quiet the way children go. Quiet when the day has used them up, not unhappily, but completely. We moved inside, and 10 minutes later, she was asleep on the living room sofa with her shoes still on and grass stains on both knees and one sock partially off in the way that socks get when a 6-year-old has been running hard and doesn't stop to notice. I went to the bedroom and opened the cedar chest in the corner, the old one, the one I built before she was born. The blanket was folded on top. The one Margot had knitted the winter before, she got sick heavy wool in a blue-gray, the color of creek water in October. She had made it slowly over several months, working in the evenings while I read or watched the news. I had never told her I noticed how carefully she did it, how even the stitches were, how she would pull out a section and redo it if something wasn't right. I unfolded it and carried it to the living room. I laid it over Hazel carefully, slowly the way you move around, something you are not willing to disturb. The blanket settled over her small shape, and she didn't stir, her breathing unchanged. Her face slack and unguarded, the way faces only get when the person inside them has completely let go. I sat down in the armchair across from her and stayed there. Colton knocked softly before he pushed the door open. He stepped inside and stopped when he saw the room. His daughter asleep under his mother's blanket, his father in the armchair in the last of the September light. He stood in the doorway and didn't move for a long moment. We looked at each other across the room. There was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said or couldn't yet say, and so we said nothing. After a moment, I gave him a small nod. He nodded back. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was two men acknowledging that something between them might still be worth the effort of repair, and that the child sleeping between them, breathing steadily under a blanket knitted by someone they both still missed, was reason enough to try. He crossed the room quietly and lifted Hazel without waking her. Her head went to his shoulder, the way it knew where to go. Her breathing didn't change. Thanks for today," he said at the door. She's welcome here any time," I said. "She always has been." After their car disappeared down Sycamore Ridge Road, I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere between Hazel falling asleep and Colton arriving to collect her. The September sky above the oak tree was doing something worth looking at, the last light breaking apart through the upper branches. The yard settling into the particular quiet of a day that had asked something of you and given something back in equal measure. Hazel had asked me something earlier. On the swing in one of those brief still moments between the screaming and the laughing, I was still thinking about what she had asked, and about the answer I'd given her, and about whether, when she was old enough to ask it again and actually hear the full answer, I would still be here to give it. I thought I probably would be. For the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Earlier that afternoon, while I was standing behind the tire swing, watching Hazel kick her feet toward a September sky, the color of Margot's favorite scarf, she asked me something I wasn't ready for. The swing was moving in that easy arc that a good rope on a good branch makes when the weight is right back and forth, unhurried. The oak tree doing what it had been doing for 40 years without complaint. The September light was coming in, low and sideways. The particular gold of a season that knows it's leaving and wants you to notice before it goes. "Grandpa," she said on the upswing, "how come you didn't come to my party?" I looked up at the sky. 6 years old asks the question that 41 years of fatherhood could not. That is the thing about children. They walk straight through the territory that adults have spent years learning to go around. No hesitation. No awareness of the weight of what they're carrying. Just the question clean and direct, dropped into the afternoon air, the same way she dropped everything else without ceremony, without knowing what it cost. I thought about Margot. I thought about what the right answer looks like when the person asking is 6 years old and deserves the truth, but not all of it, not yet, not today. I thought about what I would say when she was old enough to hear the whole version, when she was 16 or 22, or 35, and sitting across a table from her own child, and understanding for the first time what it costs a person to stay quiet when staying quiet is the wrong choice. I would tell her all of it then. Every detail. The cake on the counter, the crown on the table. The drive down Route 7 on a Saturday morning when the traffic was light and I told myself I was only going to drive. The gate that was open. The lawn full of people who had all received the right invitation. The 2 minutes I stood at the edge of that world and watched her spin in her pink dress with her arms out and her head thrown back, laughing at something only she could feel. I would tell her that I left, because staying would have meant asking her to carry something she was too young to carry. That the hardest kind of love is the kind that removes itself from the room so the child in the room doesn't have to choose. But she was 6 years old, and 6 years old needed a different answer. Because sometimes, I said, the people who love you most are the ones waiting at home. The swing came back. She dragged her sneakers through the dirt at the bottom of the arc. The way kids do when they're thinking seriously about something, when a thought is too large to hold still with, and they need the motion to help them carry it. She considered what I'd said with the particular gravity of a child who has decided that this is a real conversation and deserves real attention. Then she went forward again. "I like it better here anyway," she said. "You have the best swing." I laughed. "Not the polite kind. Not the kind you produce when something is mildly funny and you want to be encouraging. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper than your chest. The kind that arrives before you decide to let it. The kind that tells you something true about where you actually are. Margot used to say that laugh meant I was present and not just nearby. She said she could always tell the difference. She was right. The way she was, right about most things, I took too long to understand. I had not heard that laugh from myself in longer than I could accurately account for. Hazel didn't notice. She was already kicking higher, pleased with the trajectory, the conversation complete in her mind, and the swing, the only thing that mattered now. That is the mercy of 6 years old. The question gets asked, the answer gets received. And then the swing gets higher, and the world moves on, and none of it has to be held any longer than it takes to say it. I stood behind her and kept pushing. My shoulder reminded me of my age somewhere around the 8th or 9th arc. I kept pushing anyway. Some things are worth the reminder. Sitting on the back porch now, with the coffee gone cold, and the yard going quiet, and the September dark accumulating at the tree line, the way it does not arriving, just gathering. The way things gather when the day has finally used itself up, I looked at what I actually had. A cedar chest in the garage nearly finished, still waiting for me to decide what it would hold. A small handprint pressed into air-dry clay that Hazel had found on my workbench shelf, drying now on the kitchen windowsill beside Margot's recipe book, beside Destiny's letter from Nova. Payments arriving from Colton on the 1st of each month, steady as a utility bill, without a phone call attached. An old tire swing, still moving a little in the evening breeze. I did not know what would happen next between Colton and me. Some things once broken take more than a season to repair. Maybe longer than I have left. I am 68 years old, and I have learned enough to understand that certain questions don't come with guaranteed answers, and that sitting with uncertainty is not the same as losing. I am not anyone's checkbook. I am not anyone's backup plan. I am Roland Mercer, 68 years old. A grandfather with an old tire, swing a workbench full of sawdust, and a granddaughter who thinks I have the best yard in Loudoun County. Margot would have laughed at that. She would have said, I had the best yard in Virginia, and she would have meant it. And she would have been right in the way she was always right, by exactly the right amount, never more, never less. For now that is enough. And standing here in the yard, she loved in the house she filled, pushing a swing that has outlasted more than either of us expected. For the first time in a very long time, I believe it. I spent 10 years calling it love. Looking back, some of it was fear. Fear of losing the last pieces of a family I had given everything to protect. This is a family story that doesn't end cleanly. It ends honestly with a cedar chest. I haven't filled a granddaughter who loves my tire swing and a son learning to carry his own weight. Family betrayal rarely arrives loudly. It comes in quiet things, a canceled reservation, a missed payment, a party you built with your own hands that you were never meant to attend. By the time you see it for what it is, the number on your screen reads $285,000. I believe as a man who has spoken to God more honestly in a garage than anywhere else that he never gives you more than you can carry. He just waits until you're ready to stop pretending you aren't already carrying it. Don't be like me. Every family story deserves someone willing to protect it, starting with yourself. Because family betrayal doesn't stop on its own. It stops when you decide it does. If this family story reached you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, the next one is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for reflection. If that's not for you today, find what speaks to you instead.